In November 1930, a fur trapper named Joe LaBelle arrived at a remote Inuit village on the shores of Angikuni Lake in northern Canada. He'd been there many times before. The village was always alive with activity: children playing, women preparing food, men working on their kayaks. But this time, something was wrong. The village was silent, completely silent. As Joe walked through the settlement, he found cooking pots still hanging over fire pits. Rifles were propped against doorways, something no hunter would ever abandon. Food was laid out on tables, as if people had simply stood up mid-meal and walked away. But there was no one, not a single person. An entire community of roughly 30 people had vanished without a trace. This is the story of the Angikuni Lake disappearance, one of the most debated mysteries in Canadian history. Joe LaBelle wasn't a man who scared easily. He'd spent years trapping in the isolated wilderness of northern Canada, in areas where you might not see another human being for months. But what he found at Angikuni Lake that day shook him to his core. The village wasn't abandoned in the normal sense. It looked like everyone had left in the middle of their daily routines. Kayaks were still tied to the shore. Tools were scattered around work areas. Inside the homes, he found partially eaten meals and belongings that no one would willingly leave behind. But the most disturbing detail? The sled dogs. Joe found several dogs still tethered near the village. They had starved to death. For the Inuit people, sled dogs weren't just animals, they were survival. No one would abandon them. Ever. Joe searched every dwelling. He called out. Nothing. The only sound was the wind across the frozen lake. Panicked, Joe made his way to the nearest Royal Canadian Mounted Police outpost and reported what he'd found. The Mounties conducted their own investigation, and what they discovered only deepened the mystery. When the Mounties arrived at Angikuni Lake, they confirmed Joe's account. The village was intact, but the people were gone. They documented several key pieces of evidence. First, the condition of the camp. Everything suggested a sudden departure, not an evacuation, not a planned move, but an interruption. Meals were half-finished. Sewing projects were left mid-stitch. A child's toy carved from bone sat abandoned in the snow. Second, the tools and supplies. Rifles, knives, fishing equipment, items essential for survival in the Arctic, were all left behind. In that environment, these weren't conveniences. They were life and death. Third, and perhaps most chilling, the graves. The Mounties found that the nearby burial ground had been disturbed. Stones that marked graves had been moved. Some reports claim that bodies were missing, though this detail remains disputed. Fourth, the dogs. At least 7 sled dogs were found dead, still tied to their posts. They had been left to starve. This alone suggested something catastrophic had happened. The Mounties interviewed other trappers and nearby communities. No one had seen the missing villagers. No one had heard anything unusual. It was as if 30 people had been erased from existence. The RCMP launched a search operation, but the northern wilderness is vast and unforgiving. Weeks passed with no sign of the missing villagers. As word of the disappearance spread, theories began to emerge. Theory 1. They migrated. Some suggested the villagers simply relocated to another area. Inuit communities were semi-nomadic, moving seasonally to follow game. But this theory had problems. Why would they leave everything behind? Why abandon their dogs? And why did no other community report seeing them arrive? Theory 2. Starvation and panic. Another theory proposed that the village faced a food shortage, causing mass panic. Perhaps they scattered into the wilderness in search of game and became lost or succumbed to the elements. But experienced hunters wouldn't leave their weapons, and the food found in the village suggested they weren't starving. Theory 3. Supernatural causes. Local indigenous legends spoke of spirits and creatures that inhabited the remote lakes. Some believed the villagers had been taken by something otherworldly. Joe LaBelle himself reported seeing strange lights in the sky shortly before discovering the empty village. a detail that has fueled decades of UFO speculation. Theory 4. Violence or kidnapping. Could the villagers have been attacked? The lack of blood, bodies, or signs of struggle made this unlikely, but the disturbed graves suggested someone, or something, had been there after the villagers vanished. Theory 5. Government cover-up. Some conspiracy theories claim the Canadian government knew more than they revealed. Why was the investigation closed so quickly? Were their details suppressed for political or security reasons? No concrete evidence supports this, but the lack of official documentation has kept the theory alive. Despite months of searching, no bodies were ever recovered. No survivors were ever found. The people of Angikuni Lake had simply ceased to exist. Here's where the story gets complicated. In the decades since 1930, historians and researchers have questioned whether the Angikuni Lake disappearance actually happened the way it was reported, or if it happened at all. The main source of the story is Joe LaBelle himself. His account appeared in newspapers, but official RCMP records of the investigation are either sparse or missing entirely. Some researchers have found no documentation of a formal search operation. Additionally, some historians argue that the village may not have been a permanent settlement at all. Inuit communities in that region were highly mobile, using temporary camps for seasonal hunting. What Joe LaBelle might have found was simply an abandoned seasonal camp, not unusual in itself. Others point out that similar stories existed in Canadian folklore before 1930, suggesting the Angikuni tale may have been influenced by, or even entirely based on, earlier legends. But here's what keeps the mystery alive. Joe LaBelle was a real person. His account was published in reputable newspapers, and other trappers and Mounties of that era did report strange occurrences in the region, including abandoned camps, unexplained lights, and missing persons. So what really happened? If we separate fact from speculation, here's what we can say with reasonable certainty. Something unusual happened in the Angikuni Lake region around 1930. Whether it was a mass disappearance or a misunderstood event is unclear, but Joe LaBelle's account was taken seriously enough at the time to prompt an investigation. The most likely explanation, according to modern researchers, is a combination of factors. The village was probably a seasonal camp. When the hunting season ended or resources became scarce, the inhabitants moved on. In their haste, perhaps due to sudden weather changes or other pressing reasons, they left behind more than usual. The dead sled dogs could have been sick or injured animals deliberately left behind, a harsh but practical decision in survival situations. The disturbed graves might have been the work of animals, or even other travelers passing through. But this explanation doesn't account for everything. Why did Joe LaBelle, an experienced trapper familiar with Inuit customs, find the scene so disturbing? Why were there reports of strange lights? And why has no definitive evidence, either proving or disproving the mass disappearance, ever surfaced? The truth is, we may never know exactly what happened at Angikuni Lake. What we do know is this. In one of the most remote places on Earth, an entire community vanished. Whether they walked away, were taken, or never existed in the numbers reported, the mystery endures. The wilderness of northern Canada holds countless secrets. Vast, frozen, and unforgiving, it's a place where people can disappear without a trace. And sometimes, the silence itself is the most haunting evidence of all. The Angikuni Lake mystery remains unsolved, and perhaps in that frozen wilderness, it always will be. If you want to hear more mysteries like this, check out the full story of the Flannan Isles lighthouse keepers on my channel. And let me know in the comments, what do you think really happened at Angikuni Lake?